Let's talk about what a weird bunch of little freaks us horror fans are. A few weeks ago, I was walking around a bookshop, and I was looking for something fresh. I was feeling burned out and burdened by the hefty literary fiction that I'd been reading recently, just one heavy book after another, and I wanted to spend some time in my comfort zone, which is when I realised that that comfort zone is horror. But when I say I was burned out on literary fiction and I needed something comfortable, that doesn't mean I wanted to escape heavy themes and political ideas. It doesn't mean I wanted to switch my brain off, because I don't really like switching my brain off. And horror is inherently political. So that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is I wanted to spend time in a dark, sad, claustrophobic space full of threats and death and violence. And that was my comfort zone. Why is that? Why is it that for so many horror fans, we find comfort in horror? We find the frightening and bleak, discomforting settings of horror stories so comforting, so exciting, and so cathartic. I think catharsis is the key word here. Horror fiction feels comforting and cathartic. Why? I've raised this point in videos before, but only very, very briefly, and I've talked to my patrons about it on my Patreon Discord. If you want to be one of those patrons that has a chat with me on my Discord every single day, then absolutely you can support me on Patreon. Yeah, just go to patreon.com/WillowTalksBooks and support me. That would be cool, yeah. Let's have a chat. I'm glad you brought it up. And what a lot of people have said when I've talked about this is that horror gives us a unique window into danger. It gives us a unique opportunity to see danger, to get very, very close to danger, even in a fictional sense, and yet know that we ourselves are not in danger. It's very voyeuristic. And in that sense, it feels kind of sadistic. You can get very close to danger, you can feel all of the feelings of the people in danger, but you yourself are safe. It's kind of like a roller coaster. In fact, it's exactly like a roller coaster. You get the excitement, you get the threat, you get the nervousness, you get the unknown of it all, but you're not in any real danger. Horror movies and TV shows do it too, obviously. And I was going to say horror video games, but horror video games are even more visceral, because you are in control of the character who's in danger, and I've played a lot of horror video games where I have panicked and screamed and just let my character die because I've fallen into that fight, flight, or freeze response. I have frozen and my character has died. Horror video games are so visceral because they take you that one step further, where you actually do feel like you're in danger. If you're immersed enough in the experience, you are that character, you are responsible for their life, and I have literally experienced fight, flight, or freeze as a character in a horror video game. So we won't touch on that. That's a whole different kind of stress. But when it comes to horror movies and horror novels, the voyeurism, the almost maybe sadistic nature of enjoying horror is so fascinating. Maybe labeling us all as sadistic is a little bit harsh, because we're not actively enjoying what these characters go through. We usually bond with them and worry for their safety and feel really sad when they die, or if they die. So sadistic is probably the wrong word there. It's definitely secondhand excitement from the comfort of your own chair. And more than one person, including my partner, have said that this might be some kind of a trauma response, that putting ourselves close to danger feels comfortable because it's familiar. That is something I'm kind of terrified of diving into, especially in a YouTube video. That's probably a private investigation, but if you're one of those horror fans who understands what I'm saying here and does feel kind of comforted by the stress of horror stories, maybe do some introspective digging on that, like I probably should. Is this a trauma response? If so, what does that mean? Regardless the source or the reason, horror stories do elicit secondhand excitement and allow us to enter a weird kind of comfortable space, to feel a sense of catharsis and relief, to allow us to de-stress. And to illustrate that, I'm going to talk about 3 novels that I read recently which I recommend to you. The first is Hell House by Richard Matheson. Now, you might know the name Richard Matheson from I Am Legend, his most famous novel. I've talked about that book before, because the I Am Legend film starring Will Smith isn't very good. And these days the film is arguably more famous than the novel, which is a real shame because the film sucks. I Am Legend, the novel, is absolutely brilliant. A very clever, very unique, very original vampire story. About 15 years after that book was published, Hell House came out. Hell House, in some ways, feels like the perfect distillation iteration of the haunted house story. You've got 4 people who've been tasked with spending a week in a haunted house. 2 of those people are psychic mediums. And one of those 2 mediums was the only survivor of a trip to this house years ago when he was just a teenager. And now he's around the age of 40 and he's going back in. The other 2 people going into this house are a man named Barrett, who is a scientist slash skeptic who does not believe in ghosts and thinks there is a more rational and arguably very interesting explanation for paranormal activity, and his wife, who just wanted to tag along. And it's here that I want to be very upfront about the fact that this is an enormously sexist book. People have criticised I Am Legend for being sexist as well, but honestly, I don't remember. I read that book when I was at university, I really loved it, and I didn't pay attention to any of that at the time. But I just read Hell House, and it is pretty sexist. At the beginning, it is made very explicit that Barrett's wife is tagging along because one time he spent 3 weeks on a trip to London, and she had a complete mental breakdown. She stopped eating during that time, and when he came back, she lied and said she had suffered with the flu while he was gone. She cannot survive without him, so she's come along to this haunted house. She's also about 20 years younger than he is. And there's plenty more misogyny besides, but I won't get into that. If we put the sexism aside for a second, and I'm not saying we should, this is a very, very good haunted house story. It very much reminded me of The Haunting of Hill House by Shelley Jackson, and Shelley Jackson is one of my favourite authors. But the blend of science and skepticism with psychic mediums makes this a very fresh and kind of thrilling novel in its setup. The Hell House in question is in Maine. Our protagonists leave New York City, they head up to Maine, and this house is in this swampy nowhere. The house was originally owned by a man called Belasco. He was filthy rich, and he spent so much of his time hosting lengthy soirees that were the most depraved things you could imagine. Belasco was rich and he was a psychopath, as in my opinion all billionaires are. And he would have people stay at this house for months or years at a time, and he would actively encourage people to engage in the most debauched, depraved, dangerous and illegal things you can imagine. Things that I cannot say on camera. Just use your imagination. It is awful stuff. And as a result, this is a house of murder and suicide, and it is chock full of ghosts. Apparently, it is the most haunted place in the world. People who've gone in to investigate have died doing so, and they probably have joined the pantheon of ghosts there. You'll have to read on to find out. And we're going to spend several days with our team of investigators exploring this house, learning about its history, and experiencing all of its paranormal terror. It's such a simple and compelling idea for a story. And it's exactly what I mean when I talk about the comfort of reading horror stories, because this is particularly voyeuristic. You have a group of 4 people in a haunted house that has bricked up windows, and they are there to experience the hauntings and find an explanation for them, and you just watch it all unfold. You experience the terror, you experience the creepiness, you experience the dread, but it's like you're watching a dollhouse full of dolls being haunted. It is exciting, it is really terrifying in places, and you get to just watch. There is something so thrilling in that. Perhaps one of the most unique, exciting, and daring horror novels I've read in maybe forever is Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen. This book was recommended to me by one of my patrons, Rachel. Thank you so much for your recommendation. I actually rushed out to buy this from my local bookshop as soon as you recommended it to me. And what I loved immediately about this book is its enigmatic and kind of chilling title. When you read the blurb, you learn what it's about, and you learn the names of the characters, and none of those characters are called Patricia. So who is Patricia, and why does she want to cuddle? The more I thought about this title, the more I had chills, and that was so riveting. On the face of it, when you read the blurb, this is the most heterosexual shit. The main cast of characters in this book are a group of contestants on a reality TV show. This show is called The Catch, and it is just The Bachelor. Now, I'm queer, so I've never seen The Bachelor or Love Island, but I get the basic idea. There's a sexy guy, he's probably rich, probably successful, and a bunch of girls compete to try to marry him. Okay, our protagonists are the final 4 contestants and the catch himself. who invented a version of Instagram and is now definitely poor, but they're not supposed to know that. And there's also the crew as well. There's the host of the show, a cameraman, and the producer. And you get to know all of these people. Every episode they've gone from location to location, and the finale is being filmed on a weird, isolated island off the coast of Washington State, right in the northwestern tip of the continental United States. This place is called Otter's Island, and a lot of people have gone missing on this island over the last few decades. Hikers and campers, they've just disappeared. The chapters in this novel shift perspective between the different characters, but in between those chapters we also sometimes get things like Reddit discussion threads about the show, and blog posts from a girl who went to the island to find her missing sister, who was one of the hikers who just vanished. So you get little epistolary snippets like that throughout the novel, which I really enjoyed. But as soon as they arrive on Otter's Island, they meet an old lesbian whose wife died recently, who hosts them at her B&B. And as they make their way around the island, there are various sightings of this Sasquatch-looking thing. A big, hairy, vaguely human-like looking thing. And as soon as you see it, you think, that's probably Patricia, isn't it? But who and what is Patricia? This is a horror comedy novel. There is a lot of hilarity here, and on the face of it, it feels very heterosexual. But all of the publicity around this book calls it very, very queer, so I was so intrigued by that. In order to talk about the queerness of it, I would have to spoil some things, and I'm not going to do that. This is a book that hilariously makes fun of heterosexual culture without apology, and then by the end you see all of the queer liberation of it. I'm not going to explain how or any of the details, just the themes that are made clear by the end. See, Patricia Wants to Cuddle is kind of about literally killing the patriarchy, disposing of heteronormativity. It's about queer liberation in its most aggressive and horror-fueled form. It's very, very daring in that way, and I absolutely loved it for that. There's a lot of gore in here. There are some really gruesome deaths. It is a kind of slasher story, so you would expect that. But at no point did I feel frightened, because I didn't bond with any of these characters, except for one. One of these final four girls you're supposed to bond with. She's the only one who is queer. She's the only one who is black. She's the only one who, right from the beginning, it is made very apparent, isn't plastic in any way. This book is not subtle in the way that it draws a very thick dividing line between patriarchal heteronormativity and queer and minority groups, and the bloody liberation of one from the other. It is not subtle. In that way, it's kind of silly. It lacks nuance entirely. It is just having fun with the idea of ripping the patriarchy to shreds through the lens of a horror story. So when I talked earlier about horror being voyeuristic, this takes that to a new degree. Rather than watching people in a terrifying situation and worrying for them and attaching yourself to them, as you do with Hell House and other scary stories, where you worry about their safety and you hope they're going to be okay, but you also take solace in the fact that you are okay the whole time, and there's this very strong emotional bond, none of that's really true here. This is more guilty, voyeuristic enjoyment of the suffering of rubbish people. And I loved it. When I talked at the beginning about being in a bookshop and looking for something that I would classify as comforting, it was this book that I picked up, Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison. Black Sheep is tons of fun. It was exactly what I was looking for. It is set in the modern day. We begin in New York City with a protagonist called Vesper. She's in her early 20s, she's working a terrible waitressing job. It is thankless, it is exhausting, and early on she does something to get her fired from that job. And on the very same day that she got fired, she received an invitation to return home to New Jersey to attend a wedding. Now, she hasn't been back home since her 18th birthday, which I think was 6 years ago. But she ends up saying yes to the invitation. She is too curious not to. And the reason she's curious is because the couple getting married are her ex-boyfriend and her cousin. She can't say no to that, but she really doesn't want to go back. The idea is giving her anxiety, and we steadily learn more about her childhood and why she left. As it turns out, her mother was a scream queen in slasher horror films throughout the 70s and 80s. She's famous, or maybe infamous, in horror fandom circles for being a legendary scream queen. But what a lot of people don't know about her is that she also lives in an isolated satanic cult in New Jersey where she raised her daughter, Vesper. Just a handful of hours before she turned 18, Vesper left. She got a bus to New York, she started a new life, and she didn't look back until now. She's not just returning home to a terrible, awful family, she's returning home to a cult. And one thing that kind of gave me the ick about this is that I'm an atheist, I don't know much about Satanism and the Satanic Bible and blah blah blah, but I've heard a lot of talk on the internet that Satanism is really, really chill. That it's not actually about worshipping the devil, but it's just kind of an alternate belief system about being good to each other. It is deceptively chill and more focused on the community aspect. That said, I'm also a fan of black metal music, and black metal music has a long history of Satanism related to murder and arson and church burnings and all sorts of terrible things. And when I remembered that, I kind of went, okay, sure, let's go with this. These are the bad Satanists. They worship the devil, they think he's real, and Vesper's heading back there to spend a little time amongst these people. You know shit's gonna go down, and I cannot really tell you any more. Other than the fact that weird stuff happens around Vesper right from the beginning. It seems like she maybe has some sort of weird power, but she's really not aware of it. She thinks that these things are coincidences at the beginning. And when she gets to this isolated cult community for the wedding, she starts seeing creepy things in her bedroom or out of her bedroom window. And you'll find yourself getting goosebumps in these moments. They're creepy. They'll set your teeth on edge. But what are they all building towards? What is all of this for? This is a satanic cult with very, very rigid rules, and she has returned to them. What the hell is going to happen to her? I was so excited to find out, and I wasn't disappointed with where the story goes. It's not a revolutionary story, it's not the greatest horror novel of all time, and I was never really terrified, just creeped out in certain moments. But this was a real thrill ride of a horror story. You're not going to be terrified by it. You're going to be a little bit chilled, and you're going to enjoy it. You're going to have fun with it. It's a story about cult mentality. It's a story about family ties, about blood being thicker than water. It's a story about childhood traumas and a lot of other heavy things, but it's so much fun, it's so thrilling, that all of that is very digestible. It's there, you can read into it, you can relate to it maybe, as I did, but you'll still be able to have a lot of fun with it. This is exactly what I talk about when I say that horror is fun, horror is escapist, horror is cathartic and weirdly comforting. Because when I finished this story, I felt kind of cleansed by it all, as catharsis does to us. I went through a thrilling, terrifying journey with this protagonist. I hoped that she was going to be okay by the end, that she would win whatever she needs to win, she would survive, she'd get out, but she'd go through a lot along the way. And I went through all of it with her, and I felt better afterwards. Catharsis is the thing when it comes to horror stories like this one. Whether you actually feel terrified by the book or not, it's not really about that. It's about the setting, the events, what the protagonist comes up against, how in danger they are, how they survive threats, they survive danger. They go through really horrible, traumatizing things, and sometimes it doesn't matter if they survive or not. You've survived, the reader, and so you kind of feel better, and there's the catharsis. I've had a blast with all three of these books. I recommend all of them completely. However, Hell House is very sexist. Black Sheep isn't really scary, so that might not do it for everyone. And while Patricia Wants to Cuddle isn't really scary either, it is full of gore, and it is full of queer, anti-patriarchal, anti-heteronormative themes that I absolutely adored. So if I had to recommend one wholeheartedly, it would be Patricia Wants to Cuddle. But if you're looking for some catharsis from your horror stories, all three of these will do it for you. I hope you enjoyed, and subscribe for books.